Welcome. This is the Sunday morning sermon for June the 12th of 2022. We are working our way through the book of James in a series of messages entitled A Sorcerer's Guide. Today we come to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. And the message this morning is entitled, When You're Treated Unfairly. Have you ever been treated unfairly? It's not nice to be treated that way, but how do we respond? How are we to respond when we are treated unfairly? The way that we respond says a lot about us. In our text, Peter tells us that we've been given an example that we are to follow when it comes to knowing how to respond to suffering that is caused by unfairness. And we are unfairly suffering because of something that maybe is not even our fault. Look at verse 21. Peter says, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." How did Jesus respond to suffering? How did Jesus respond to unjust treatment? What example did he set for us? Look at verses 22 and 23. "He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." Peter says following Jesus' footsteps can be summed up in just two words. What are they? We are to respond to people who treat us unfairly. How are we to respond? Well, there's a hint. They're the first two words of our text. Submit ourselves. Now, if those two words don't sit well with you, imagine what it was like for the Christians who first read Peter's letter. Remember, they had been scattered, put in exile because of their faith. They were facing the threat of even more persecution because of their faith in Jesus. Persecution by the government, persecution by their neighbors, persecution by their employers. And yet Peter doesn't leave any wiggle room here. He says, submit yourselves to every human authority, whether the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Verses 13 and 14. Let's remind ourselves exactly who Peter is referring to. Who was the emperor? Who were the governmental authorities when Peter wrote these words? The emperor was Nero. Nero, who led a great persecution against the Christians. He blamed them for the fire that nearly destroyed Rome, nearly burned it to the ground. He had Christians covered with tar, and then he hung them on poles and set them on fire to provide light for his garden at night. This was an evil man, Nero. In fact, it was under Nero that Peter was eventually martyred. Other authorities at the time were, of course, Pontius Pilate, who had Jesus crucified, Felix, who rejected Paul's testimony and left him in prison because that's where the Jews wanted him to be. So submitting themselves to these guys was something radical for the Christians. I can imagine the first church to hear their pastor read this letter to them would have said, "Oh, wait a minute. Did you read that right? We submit to those guys?" And let's be honest here. Submitting is difficult even for us, even when we aren't facing hardship. I mean, our natural response to rules is to rebel against them. You know, when you see a speed trap, a speed camera, you slow down. What do you do when you get past it and you're out of range? Well, you speed back up a little bit. If you're during the COVID uh, time, and Sobeys and the others grocery stores, they had the aisles marked with arrows, and you were to only go one direction. And you go into Sobeys, and you're walking at the end of the aisle, and there's the type of cereal that you want sitting right there, but the arrow's pointing the other way. Do you go all the way around and come back down the aisle the right way? Well, of course not. You back your cart up, make like you're going the right way. Take your cart back up to 10 feet and pick the cereal off the shelf, and then come back out again. Not going to go all the way around. We rebel against the rules. My point is, submission doesn't come easy for us. Doesn't come natural. So when we're told to submit ourselves to difficult people, we don't respond well. Let me put it this way. The word submit means to put under. We would prefer to be put over those who treat us unfairly, not to be put under them. But listen up. This particular Greek word that's being used here adds a new shade to the meaning of submission. Submission, it says, place yourself in submission. This Greek word is in the middle voice, the middle tense of the Greek language. So it literally means place yourself in submission. In other words, it's not something done to you, it's something you decide to do. It's you obeying the one-way aisles at Sobeys, whistling through your mask as you do it. Biblical submission is placing yourself under someone by choice. It's not done to you, rather it's done by you. Now, obviously, there are limits as to how much we should place ourselves in submission to others. God isn't using Peter here to tell us to always obey earthly rulers. There are lots of examples in God's word of people who did not submit to pharaohs or kings or councils, because that submission would have meant that they would be disobeying God. When Pharaoh told the Hebrew midwives to kill all the newborn baby boys, they refused to do it, and they were commended for that. Daniel and his friends disregarded the governmental orders when the king commanded them to stop praying to God and to worship him, to worship idols. They would not do it. In the book of Acts, we even read of a time where Peter himself didn't submit to the government. Remember when Peter was told to no longer speak about Jesus? He was to no longer share his faith. And Peter said to the Jewish council in Acts chapter 4, verse 20, we can't help but speak about what we have seen and heard. And in chapter 5, he explains by saying, we must obey God rather than man. But Peter does tell us that as long as obeying earthly authorities doesn't conflict with obeying God, we are to submit. But why? Why submit to rulers who are not godly? Well, first of all, Peter says one reason we do that is for the Lord's sake. Verse 13, he says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men." Listen to the way the Message paraphrases those verses. It says, "Make the master proud of you by being good citizens. Respect the authorities, whatever their level. They are God's emissaries for keeping order. Exercise your freedom by serving God, not by breaking the rules. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Respect the government." The point here is that we are to submit, we are, or when we submit, we are not just submitting to rulers, we're submitting to God. We submit ourselves for the Lord's sake. We're honoring God. When we obey earthly leaders, when we submit, it makes God proud to see us showing that we have self-control, that we go against the sinful flow of this world and show respect even to disrespectful people. Here's the second reason. Peter says we submit even when treated unfairly, and we do that for the sake of our testimony, he says. In verse 15, he says, "For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." Again, the Message words it this way. It says, "It is God's will that by doing good you might cure the ignorance of fools who think you're a danger to society." Now, the people that Peter is writing to, those first century Christians, were being slandered. They were indeed being treated badly. There were people saying that they were a danger to society. Some accused them of insurrection because they talked about furthering the kingdom of God. And the non-believers heard this and they spread the rumor that Christians were going to overthrow the Roman government. Some accused these first century Christians of atheism because they didn't worship Caesar or the many Roman gods. So they said that they were atheists. Some said they were cannibals because of their misunderstanding of the communion sacrament. They had heard Christians talk about Jesus' statement where he said, "Except you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot have part of me." And they took it literally. They called them cannibals. Of course, the natural response to all of this is to come out as defensive, sue for slander. But through Peter, God says, don't do that. Don't even think of doing that. Silence this ignorance by living a godly life, he says. Don't do wrong back to them. No, show them that they're wrong by living rightly. Listen, our tools as Christians are different than those that the world uses. We know there's no right way to do a wrong thing. Obeying our leaders, paying taxes, even if we don't approve of the way the money is being spent, obeying the law, even if we don't like the lawmaker, is a powerful testimony. Peter is saying we win our right to be heard when we are good citizens. Now, verses 18 through 20, There, Peter includes not just governmental leaders in his instruction to submit to others, but he also talks there to slaves and masters. That's hard to hear, isn't it? But that's what Peter says. Verses 18 through 22, he says, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? If you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God." Let me say a couple of things here. First of all, the Bible does not condone slavery, and Peter is not condoning slavery here. He's simply acknowledging the existence of slavery. And boy, did it ever exist in those days. As much as a third of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. There were slaves and there were masters even within the congregations of the churches where this first letter that Peter wrote, where it was read. There were slaves and masters in those congregations. Secondly, slavery in the Roman Empire was not like slavery that we think of. In the Roman Empire, slavery was more of a social class, and it wasn't race-based. In fact, in his commentary on this passage, David Helm says that the word translated as slaves comes from the Greek word for household servants. And he goes on to point out that in the Roman Empire, in the Roman world, there were three classes of citizens. There was the Roman citizen who had the full rights and the protection of the law. There were also freedmen who had restricted protections but still enjoyed a great deal of autonomy. And then thirdly, there was the servant class. These were the men and women who served as managers and helpers of the businesses and the homes of the day. There were doctors, there were accountants who were in the servant class. Helm says a closer modern day parallel to servants in the Roman Empire. He says a closer modern day parallel to that class of citizen would be someone who might have received their medical training through the military. And now they owed the government a certain period of time where they must serve in military hospitals. They give you your training and you provide so many years of service. It's not a perfect parallel, but it's a better picture of the slavery that Peter is talking about. It's a better picture of what it was like. Again, the Bible is not condoning that. It's just acknowledging that it existed. So this is a class of people to whom Peter addresses his comments. He's saying, when you live a godly life in front of your employer, in front of your owner, even when they treat you poorly, it validates your testimony. It gives power to your witness. Let me just close with a story that's told by Reverend Mark Adams of Redland Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. He writes, last week at our deacon meeting, our deacon chairman shared a testimony. He said, some of you know that I work at the local transit authority as an electronic technician. I've been working there for 19 years. About 3 years ago, a new supervisor came into our shop, and as soon as he got there, he began to harass me and other co-workers who were black. We had several confrontations to the point where I scheduled a meeting with him and his supervisors, and I addressed my supervisor directly and asked, "What have I done to you? What have I done to your family that you treat me this way?" He says he didn't respond. He didn't reply. I told him, he says, it's illegal for you to harass and to bully people because of the color of their skin. I said the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on color of skin or religion or race or national origin. And I told him he must treat all of us equally. After the meeting, he said things got better for about a week. After that, he says, my supervisor continued to treat me and the other black co-workers the same as he had before. So I put together evidence of his abuse. 5 of my co-workers signed in as witnesses. I scheduled an appointment with the Civil Rights Department for a Monday morning. But on Sunday at church, we studied the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus says we must forgive those who trespass against us. I found myself wrestling with God as I sat in my seat. I told myself, you should have slept in today, because you cannot forgive that guy. At the end of the service, we were challenged to think of someone in our lives that we needed to forgive, and I continued to wrestle with God. After church, I continued to pray. Finally, I came to the conclusion that God must be first in my life. He wants me to forgive my supervisor, and so I need to do that. When I got home, I canceled the Monday meeting and told the people in charge that everything was okay now. On Tuesday, my co-workers gathered around, all excited, wanting to hear how the meeting had gone with Metro on Monday. I told them I went to church Sunday and God told me to forgive our supervisor. They were speechless. Even the ones who were Christians could not believe what had happened. Now, I had not told my supervisor about the meeting at the Metro headquarters. But from that moment, from the moment I decided to forgive him, from that moment on, he began to treat us differently. In fact, he says we've become good friends. And people in the shop have noticed it. About a month later, one of my friends asked me, what kind of voodoo did you use on that guy? He treats you better than anyone else. I told him that as a Christian, I serve God, not man, and God is all powerful. Nothing is impossible with God. Okay, what does Peter say we should do when we are treated unfairly? We follow Jesus' example. We submit ourselves. Why do we do that? We do it for the Lord's sake. We do it for the sake of our testimony. How do we live in a world where we are sojourners, headed for heaven? This world is not our home. We find difficulties everywhere. Well, when we find ourselves in a position where we were being unfairly treated, Peter tells us, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake and for the sake of your testimony. Thank you for joining us today. Next Sunday, of course, is Father's Day, so we'll break away from the series on Sojourners for 1 week. And we'll look at Father's Day next Sunday. Hope you'll join with us then. And then the Sunday after that, the 26th of June, we'll continue with our series on 1 Peter. Until then, God bless, and let's continue to exchange prayers daily.